Yeah, so we're about to go ahead and knock out this quick review for the story part. So the story I thought was very interesting because it starts off where Deadpool 2 pretty much ends, where it's like that little grim ending, and Deadpool pretty much is trying to find himself in the world. He has to get a job. He broke up with Vanessa, so he decides he wants to try to time travel, and he time travels eventually to the current MCU that we know, so he could talk with Happy Hogan about trying to become an Avenger, which I find funny because there's no Avengers, but it's still interesting though. He does his little interview and he makes funny jokes. The funny jokes I thought were hilarious was making fun of Happy Hogan, because we know Happy Hogan, as much as Happy Hogan tries to sell himself as being important, he's really not. He's just Iron Man's chauffeur. He's just the guy who works under Iron Man. Like, go watch the Spider-Man movies, the Iron Man movies. Head of security. No, you're head of taking Tony Stark home and making sure he gets home safe to his wife. That's it. But I thought it was hilarious that Deadpool was making fun of that. So eventually, it cuts over to Deadpool at his apartment, and it's his birthday. And eventually he gets a knock from the TVA from Loki. So they end up picking him up and trying to recruit him to the TVA. But Deadpool, of course, gives off a fight. He puts up a big fight because he's not trying to be recruited. I like how the movie still feels like Deadpool 1 and 2, like how it does the flash forward and flash back. Because you know how most of these superhero movies are. It takes forever to get into the action. So the movie is interesting so far and has you engaged. The intro, the beginning credits of the movie, I thought went on a little bit too long. It wasn't as cool as the first Deadpool movie. It was cool to see him cut up and kill a lot of the TVA guys from Loki, because Loki wasn't that good of the show. But I felt like it did go on for a little bit too long, and the music, I didn't care for the music in that scene. So after that long sequence, we finally get the TVA. It cuts over to the TVA questioning Deadpool about wanting to join the 616, or the main MCU timeline. I'm not going to call it 616 because that's the comics, but the main MCU timeline, which I thought was interesting because Deadpool, we already know first he said he wanted to be an Avenger and be somebody. So he's like, yeah, I can finally do that, and then maybe go back home and let my loved ones and Vanessa and them know. And that's when he meets Mr. Paradox, a new member from the TVA, and he's like, oh, well, that's not going to be possible, because if you go back home, that universe is going to be destroyed. So you have to stay in this main MCU timeline, otherwise this universe is going to be destroyed. So I thought that was interesting. That was an interesting time plot. I mean, yeah, it does sound a little generic, but it's Deadpool. They had to fit him in this universe in somehow, because this is like Ryan Reynolds Deadpool from the Fox universe, which got brought by Disney. So as far as the humor goes, the humor was definitely there, and some of the jokes definitely landed. So eventually he steals the device from Mr. Paradox because he found out that Logan was the anchor to his universe. That's why his universe is dying. So, so he needs Wolverine pretty much. So he steals Wolverine. He steals Mr. Paradox's device so he can go and look for another Wolverine. And I like the little flash sequences we get where they're trying to find a different Wolverine, and there's different Wolverine from different different iterations of Wolverine from the comics that we know of. Like, we saw the short guy Wolverine, which I thought was hilarious, because a lot of idiot comic book fans / geeks that set their expectations way too high, for some reason, have always had a problem with Hugh Jackman playing Wolverine because he's too tall. But his face literally looks like Wolverine. Look at his hair, look at his acne. I hope Hugh Jackman gets some type of nomination for his acting performance alone in this movie, because he literally did not miss a beat in this movie when he was playing Wolverine. Even all the other different versions of Wolverine, he needs some type of award. So we see the short Wolverine, and it just doesn't look right. And I like how they made fun of it too, like, oh, you're too short, and then he went to another universe to find another Wolverine. We see like a Wolverine from the Uncanny X-Men where he's like on an X cross, kind of like Jesus Christ. That looked interesting. It was raining. He went to a different universe. I don't know this Wolverine's name, but it was like a more like aggressive Wolverine that ended up beating him up. So he went to a different universe. He saw like an eye patch Deadpool, or not eye patch Deadpool. See, I keep getting the names fucked up. He saw like an eye patch version of Logan. He saw a different version of Logan that had, he kind of looked like an old man Logan. He said he might need some lotion for his face. He saw like an old man looking version of Logan that had like a shotgun. He was like a ranger or something like that. I don't know. That was cool to see. He blasted Deadpool in his face because Deadpool got annoyed. So I thought that was cool to see. We saw another version of Wolverine where he was about to fight off against the Hulk, and it looked like Mark Ruffalo's Hulk. That was cool. I know some people will probably be pissed because they're like, oh, why didn't they show the whole thing? That's not the point of the movie. He's trying to find Wolverine because it's Deadpool and Wolverine, not Deadpool Wolverine fighting the Hulk. But I thought it was cool that he made that joke like, oh, you dull creature, you don't know me or whatever. And then he bashed Deadpool into a tree and he got destroyed. So I thought that was funny. So eventually, after all these different Logans that he goes and sees in the different universe, he eventually finds the one that he needs to see, which is the one that we see in the movie. So he goes and talks to him in the bar, and of course he's in there drinking, which is something that Wolverine's known to do. He's in there drinking, the guy's trying to tell him to leave, just like we see in the trailer, and eventually Wolverine passes out because he drank too much. And then that's when they're both eventually at the TVA, and the guy's like, oh well, this is not going to work because you can't just take a Wolverine from a different timeline. But eventually Deadpool, you know, he fucks everything up, and then he ends up getting sent to a void area. And that void area kind of reminds me of like the void from Loki. So if you've seen Loki, you know, and that little cloud dust that eats everything is there too, with Cassandra Nova and her people. So eventually they land there, Deadpool wakes up, and Wolverine is on top of him. Like, he's like, hey, you want to help me get up? And then that's when Wolverine's pissed because he's like, where the hell are we? So that was pretty cool. And then they have like an epic fight. The fight was gory. The choreography was cool. And listen, as annoying as Deadpool can be, you can't tell me that he can't fight though. His choreography with those katanas, him reloading his gun and kicking up the magazine to reload it into the gun, like he knows how to fight. He's the merc with the mouth, and they literally showed that in the movie too. And I like how it wasn't just him getting his ass beat 24/7 against Wolverine, because Deadpool, in most cases, Wolverine can beat Deadpool in a fight, but Deadpool is skilled enough to get some hits in too. So I appreciate the fight wasn't just one-sided completely, but Wolverine was still fucking him up though. So eventually the fight stops and he's like, hey, no, we gotta save my people or whatever, and I can probably try to save your universe. And of course he doesn't know that because he kind of lied. So eventually they get captured soon. But before they get captured, they meet Johnny Storm, who's played by none other than Chris Evans, Captain America. And Deadpool made some jokes about like, oh, he's gonna say Avengers, but then he says flame on and then powers up and then jumps in the air. So that was cool. So then they eventually get caught by like some of the old villains who are working for Cassandra Nova. So like Azazel from the X-Men First Class movie, and Toad, and Sabretooth, and Lady Deathstrike, and Juggernaut, I think too. Before they officially got captured though, I like how Wolverine chopped off Sabretooth's fucking head though. That was hilarious. Yeah, that was just hilarious to me. He chopped off Sabretooth's head. And I like how Deadpool grabbed his head and was like, hey, I killed your leader, I killed your friends. Because you know, in certain cultures, if you chop off somebody's head, and it's just like, oh, everybody's supposed to be all scared and shit like that. But they didn't care though. They ended up capturing Deadpool and Wolverine, and they ended up being brought to Cassandra Nova, who was she was surprisingly happy to see them. Like, oh wow, I've always wanted a Wolverine. because I guess she's used to getting different versions of characters in the universe and using them to her advantage, because she's very good at manipulating people with her telepathy. So she's literally a reverse Professor X and her twin. This character has existed since the early 2000s. So she can be interesting, and I thought she was pretty interesting in this movie as far as like female villains go, because most of these female villains suck in the MCU. But I thought they used her pretty well. Her powers were just like how they're supposed to be. She moves things, she gets inside of your head. That was something else too. So there were some weird scenes like where she actually puts her fingers like right through people's heads and stuff like that, and like she can actually see your thoughts just like Professor X can. So I thought it was interesting stuff too. There was a scene, however, where they have to escape. So basically they have to escape this area or whatever, because it's like a cloud thing or whatever from Loki that's gonna eat the area. I forget, but they ended up having to escape, and they end up landing like in the middle of nowhere, where they see like a Ryan Reynolds clone show up, and that clone ends up having Dogpool with him. Now I don't care for Dogpool because I think Dogpool looks ugly. I'm not one of those people that likes ugly dogs, and I like dogs because I have two. They weren't ugly though. I don't like those ugly looking dogs. But anyway, Deadpool falls in love with Dogpool, which is just like in the comics. And this nice guy, Ryan Reynolds variant with long hair, I guess is just a regular, like he's just a regular Wade Wilson. He doesn't have like actual powers, because he ends up being killed later in the movie. So eventually Logan is telling Wade that he's pissed because it seems like he's hiding something about this whole saving his world. And that's when Wade Wilson is like, oh, well, I think that we might be able to save it. And then that's when Wolverine gets pissed, and they have a big fight again. That fight was something else too. It was a fight in the car. And that fight lasted for a good while too. Eventually, when the fight ends, that's when a mysterious figure gets inside of the car and drives them away to a unnamed location, an undisclosed location, I should say. And we see it's a bunch of Resistance members, and the person who brought them there, who was the one driving, was none other than X-23, aka Laura from the Logan movie. I thought that was cool too. If you like X-23 and if you know the comics, she was cool in that movie too. So she's there with the Resistance members. We see Elektra from the Elektra movie and the Daredevil movie. I didn't care for Elektra, and nobody in the theater I was in clapped. I don't know why they brought Elektra back, especially this Elektra, but whatever. Blade was there though. Blade looked something else. He looked cool. Blade had a lot of cool scenes when he was in there kicking ass. Wesley Snipes, Blade, oh my gosh. And then we saw Gambit for the first time, played by Channing Tatum. It was kind of cool because Channing Tatum was supposed to play Blade, or he was supposed to play Gambit for a very long time, but just things haven't worked out, and the movie ended up being delayed, and they just canceled it. So this was basically his time to play Gambit because they've always wanted him to. And plus, he's friends with Ryan Reynolds. He looked good in the costume. He had the comic accurate costume. He had the voice down. He had the Cajun accent. So I didn't really have an issue with him playing Gambit. Yeah, his face looked a little weird, but his accent sounded just like Gambit from the comics, where it's hard to understand his voice because he's got like that Cajun accent. So eventually he decides he wants to team up with this group so they can help him defeat Cassandra Nova. But eventually it's like they're like, oh, I don't know, we might not be able to do this, but they eventually ended up doing it. They team up, they fight against Cassandra Nova's group, which was like Juggernaut and Azazel and all those other bad guys from the old X-Men movies. That was cool to see. They were basically Blade, Elektra, and Gambit were dealing with them, while Wolverine and Deadpool eventually had to get their way into Cassandra Nova's office so they can deal with Cassandra Nova. And they tried to plead with Cassandra Nova, and of course she was being a bitch. She was like, oh, you're basically stuck here, I can't send you nowhere. Basically, you're gonna stay in this universe forever type thing. And that's when Wolverine tries to like stab her, and of course Wolverine, she ends up like throwing him into the ground and then throwing Deadpool away. And during that time, she gets into Wolverine's head, and Wolverine, she sees all of the pain that Wolverine had to deal with that they explained it earlier in the movie, like him like feeling guilty for letting the rest of the X-Men die and things like that. And that's why he wears that yellow suit with pride, because that's what Scott and them would have wanted, and that's what reminds him of wanting to wear the costume with pride, but so he doesn't forget his fellow X-Men member. So I thought that was definitely commendable on Wolverine's part. So if anybody doesn't see that part of the story good, or doesn't think it's at least inspiring for that version of Wolverine, then you are at lost, as Obi-Wan would say. I thought that was really interesting, and you could tell that this Wolverine had a really good relationship with Professor X. Usually most Wolverines do. So I feel like that's how he was able to defeat Cassandra Nova, when Cassandra Nova was able to get inside of Wolverine's head. Because when Cassandra Nova tried to reveal all of that and say, oh, I could set you free and all this stuff, basically trying to put Wolverine under her control, Wolverine was like, no, I have you under my control. And then he snaps out of it and stabs her. And then that's when Deadpool grabs Juggernaut's helmet and puts it on her, and that incapacitates her. So I thought that was cool. They put some thought into it. It wasn't just something corny. And it wasn't corny because, somebody like Wolverine is used to the telepathic, people getting into his head and stuff like that. Professor X gets into his head all the time. So I thought that was really cool too. So that's how they kind of incapacitated her for the moment. But eventually they reasoned with her for a little bit temporarily, because she found out that Mr. Paradox was trying to betray her. So now she's going after Mr. Paradox, apparently, and basically was letting Deadpool and Wolverine fuck off in the meantime. She gets the sling ring from Doctor Strange, because Deadpool mentions it. He's like, oh, that's the sling ring. That's from Doctor Strange. She gets the sling ring, allows them to go back to the main MCU timeline free, which they should have thought was a trap, but she was like, oh, you only have 10 seconds, because I guess those purple clouds from Loki were about to suck up the rest of the universe. So I thought that was pretty cool too. They hop out of the portal back into the main timeline, and then eventually they have a big fight with some of the Deadpool variants, and they were cool to see on screen. You saw like Lady Deadpool, you saw Ronin Deadpool, Cowboy Deadpool, Kid Deadpool, Baby Deadpool, the Headpool, where it's just a floating head. There was a lot of them on screen, a lot of cool ones to see on screen too. And you see them get into this big fight scene where they fight all of these different Deadpool variants. That's when Wolverine puts his mask on for the first time, and it actually looks good too. And he keeps the mask on until pretty much the end of the movie. He still had the mask on until after they destroy Cassandra Nova, which after this fight pretty much ends, that's when they pretty much go and meet with Mr. Paradox to try to figure out what Cassandra Nova is doing. And she's pretty much on this machine that's going to suck up the rest of the resource from the multiverse that's going to destroy Deadpool's main timeline. And that's what she's going to try to use so she could free herself from the void. And that's something that they ended up having to go and stop her. They had to go and mess with one of the cords that was below where she was using that machine and overload it so it blows up. And it ended up blowing her up too. And I like how they tried to pull like, oh, well, Wolverine, you go in, or Wolverine was going to go in and try to sacrifice himself, but then he was like, oh no, I'm going to sacrifice myself. And then eventually Wolverine jumps in there, and they both like sacrificed themselves, but somehow they didn't die, even though they kept saying they were going to die. I knew they weren't going to die, because come on, if you know Wolverine and if you know Deadpool, been like in situations where their body has been blown up and destroyed to where you see nothing but skeleton, and they regenerate that from the bone. So I knew they weren't gonna die. And guess what? Wolverine's costume, like his shirt part was destroyed, but his mask was still on. So that was interesting. So with Cassandra Nova destroyed, the TVA was pretty much allowing Deadpool and Wolverine to just go free in the main timeline. I did appreciate what the TVA lady said about Wolverine, because she said that even though they can't do anything to fix his timeline, that's gonna help make him grow as a better person, because that's a part of his past, which is true, because Wolverine usually does grow from his mistakes with all his past traumas to make him a better man in the future, similar to something that Batman said in the Flash movie. So overall, I'd say this movie is a good 8 out of 10. There isn't much complaints that I have from this movie. The only complaints I have is probably just the music score, because like certain music that played in this movie I didn't really care for. I kind of just zoned out. I was like, I don't care for this. Like, they should play something else for this scene. Another thing I didn't care for. So this is a little nitpick, but I guess this is the second time that the Fantastic Four member is going to be disrespected, because the first time was back in Doctor Strange, where Wanda destroyed Mr. Fantastic, the smartest man on screen, and how he got destroyed was stupid. But then we get Johnny Storm. He gets destroyed instantly by Cassandra Nova, and it was Deadpool's fault. But I like how they at least make fun of it and say like, "Oh, it was Deadpool's fault. The fucker, you got the fucker killed or whatever." And Wolverine was pissed about it, so that was cool too. Cassandra Nova, I didn't care about this character at all when I saw the movie. I thought like she would just bring down the movie. But she was actually pretty tame and interesting to me as far as like the character herself goes. Her powers are similar to Professor X. She shares a lot of pain too, because if you know her story in the comics too, like before Professor X was born, she was supposed to be born at the same time with Professor X as twins. But something ended up happening or whatever. Like there's different versions of her comic book origin where something ends up happening where she ends up not being born, or where they're born and they end up being separated from birth, and she's evil for some reason because like Necros or something like that. I don't know. But I thought it was interesting. She sold it well, where like she had a lot of pain and trauma. And eventually where Logan brought up the fact that was able to calm her down and plead with them to let them go to the main MCU timeline. She was like, "Oh, I could see in your head that Charles loved you." And he was like, "Of course, because me and Charles are brothers." So because Charles, everybody knows how Professor X is. If Professor X knew his sister existed, he wouldn't just let his sister suffer and be evil and silent. Like, he would try to help her out. And that's what he made her realize. And she saw that in him. Even though she's evil, she was able to see that because she can read minds too. So it's not like she was one of those villains where she's a complete and total bitch, but she was still evil at the same time, and interesting to me. So I'd give this movie a good 8 out of 10. It was a fun watch. This movie won't really do anything to put a good mark on Marvel, but it is a good fun watch. It is something that I feel like it is one of the few things that's gold that they've released since Endgame, because anything else after Endgame, but there hasn't been anything. This movie, I like how they made fun of and poked fun at the MCU. Some jokes were hit or miss, but I like mainly the jokes making fun of certain characters and certain practices in the MCU, like how Disney does all the pegging. That was funny. Or how we can't use certain things, like they were talking about cocaine and stuff like that. Disney knows all the secret words, so we can't use like, oh, white snow or whatever. You want to build a snowman? Like, they were trying to be clever with that and very on the nose. So like I said, this movie's a fun watch. The action's good. I think the story has a lot of heart. Hugh Jackman was definitely the heart and soul of this movie. So if you like Hugh Jackman playing Wolverine, if you like Deadpool, if you like comic book stuff, go ahead and see this movie. This movie is more on the goofy side, of course, though. It's not like a super serious, like it's mainly a parody / buddy cop thing, and has action in it, and of course multiverse stuff in it, but it's mainly making fun of that stuff too. So hopefully going forward, we'll see Deadpool show up in other people's movies as cameos, maybe. And maybe we'll see Deadpool and Wolverine show up again in something else too, because it doesn't look like Wolverine, this is going to be his only appearance, Hugh Jackman Wolverine. I could definitely see him playing Wolverine for probably another 10 to 15 years going into Kingdom Come, because that guy, he still got it in my opinion. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this movie. Let me know what you think, and I will talk to you in the comments.
She don't wanna be saved, don't save her. 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 She don't wanna be saved.